Hello, Daniel.
Hi, Adam. How are you?
I'm all right. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Semester starts, the action has begun, and it's all face to face again, which is a nice change for a change.
Hmm. So, what are some things that are interesting you at the moment?
Well, I'm keeping being interested in many things, too many, so many things, so little time. But we can choose to talk about, well, what is it I want to choose? We can talk about personalities in interaction of artificial agents and whether we can model that in a natural way. I mean, of course, I have already an answer in the back of my mind, or I wouldn't be so bold and put it forward. But sometimes I take the risk and actually ask questions that for which I don't have an answer. So I cheated a bit today, but it's not generally that this approach is a cheat. So one of the things that, and here I'm going back to a topic we've discussed in one of our earlier sessions, and that's empowerment. Empowerment is a nice tool to model intrinsic motivations. Certainly not unique. There are other ways of doing that, but it has some nice features. And just for the listeners, for the audience that doesn't know what it is, I just mentioned again, empowerment is a way to quantify how much control an agent has over its environment and is aware of having. That's very important. It's not enough to have control. The agent needs to be aware of it. And this is model information theoretically, essentially as a channel capacity of the external perception action loop channel. That's the external part of the channel. There's an internal part. It says, how much information do I process to do things? And the external part is, how much information can I send through the environment? And the postulate behind that is that an agent evolves to be in a high empowerment state, or in a state where what it's doing, or what it's capable of doing, rather, not what it's doing, what it's capable of doing, what it's capable of picking up as outcome of this action is high. So where sensors and actuators fit. And during the lifetime of an agent, the agent wants to move to niches where this pickup is high. So think of it as empowerment as a measure of how well do you actually do the things you can actually sense you're doing. Okay, and you try to maximize that, or try to be at a good spot. And why is it a good thing? Well, we discussed in an earlier time, so I don't want to reiterate that. But essentially, it's a good thing because, first of all, it means you fit well into your sensory motor niche. And secondly, it means that you have a lot of possibilities, or more possibilities. If you have higher powered states, means you have many options. Many options means you have more ways of escaping death. That's essentially a matter. You have control over your life. I'm quoting Tobias Jung here. Yeah, I think a quote that really sums it up nicely. Being in control of your destiny is good if you know it. That's kind of the most compact way of saying it. Okay, so I
If
mentioned
you know,
empowerment, and yes,
if you know it, and so
if
what?
you know it.
And so, is it that you need to know it to know how to wield it, to know how to react in the face of that situation, or is it so? Like, what's the nature of the knowledge of your control that would be needed?
You essentially you need to be able to pick it up in principle, and you need to be able to model it. They are not distinguished in the model. In the computational model, both are treated the same way. If you don't have a good model of your future, or if your sensor can't pick up what you're doing, this appears as an uncertainty. So if you can't see what you're doing, there's no point making your actuators more precise. if you cannot actually see the outcome of your action. And there's not an a priori sense of making a sensor more precise if your actuators are very sloppy. Now, this is slightly more complicated, this part of the equation, because we know that sensors can be far more accurate than the actuators we have. We know we can detect very well that we missed to hit a target. So that part of the equation is quite more tricky. And I don't want to spend too much time on that. We think that is due to another effect, which I think we mentioned before. It's what we call a piggyback effect. But let's put it this way: as a first order of magnitude or a 0th order of approximation, if there's nothing you can pick up about your actuation, that sensor is obsolete. Basically, that's kind of the message. So if you have a cavefish and it's completely dark, and you cannot pick up any changes in visual appearance due to the movement of the agent, there's no point having eyes. So cavefish are actually blind. There's a different solution. That is the solution that you find in fish living deep in the oceans. They found a different way. They have actuators that create light. So they have these actuators where they have these bacteria that produce bioluminescence, and that can be picked up by the sensors. And so this is alternative niche. But if you did not have that, you can do away with the sensors. The story is a little bit more complicated when we just talk about presence of a sensor that is far too accurate for the actual actuator. And there is something very interesting there, but I do not wish to discuss it today because that's kind of a separate line. Or if you want me to discuss it, I can actually do it. So,
Very briefly, if you could. So the
It's
initial
not
thing
brief.
that comes to mind was sort of like a proto model of autism, but go on. Like I was wondering
It's
what that looks like.
opening a whole box. So if I go this way, that we are going on that rail. Okay, I can do it. Okay, so I open a bracket. So let's forget about empowerment for a second. Empowerment is now currently put on the stack. The idea behind what I'm talking about now is the following, and it's again an information theoretic phenomenon. As you know, I look at everything through the eyes of information theory, right? Everything I am talking about, I usually look at it through the information theoretic lens. And doing so gives us some surprising insights. And one of them is the following. If you look at the relevant information that you need to solve a task, say I give you a task to solve and you need a certain amount of information about the world to solve the task. And now this task, let's assume this task has relatively low number of outcomes, low information, not much information. But the task indicators that you have access to live in the world. So it's a bit like saying, let's make a very minimalistic example. Let's assume, look at the images, and the images are cats or dogs. So there's actually only one bit you want to distinguish, but you cannot access the label. There's no way for you to access the label. What you can access is only the image, which has an uncertain map about whether it's a cat or a dog. There's a probability distribution. And when that's the case, then it's generic that if you do a so-called information bottleneck, we have talked about that in previous sessions, but essentially think of it as an extraction mechanism, as a way of saying, how do I extract the information from the image that tells me whether it's a cat or a dog? It turns out that to access, let's assume you want to access this one bit of information from the image, the extraction might need far more information than this one bit. So in other words, you need to extract something like 10 bits, 100 bits, 1,000 bits from the image to approximate the precision of actually distinguishing the one bit that you actually want to get it, but you can't because it's only indirect. So this indirection of information can cause this effect where the information you need to extract is much higher. And this is a phenomenon, we call it the piggyback information. It's information you need to extract from the world just to get to the one bit. And you didn't care about it. You didn't care at all about this, but you had to extract it. We call this piggyback information, this hollow information, we call it the piggyback. Now, at first, this sounds like trash. It's a bit like you get this package from a well-known retailer and you unpack and the cardboard and the styrofoam and the package and so on, just to get to your computer. There's all this fluff that you want to throw away. However, we believe, and this is our hypothesis, that this phenomenon actually leads in evolution to the emergence of sensors that actually do much more than what they originally evolved to do. It's not always happening. It depends really on the structure of how the labels or the relevant information is hidden in the world, right? Sometimes you may not. You may just get the information out of the box, no superfluous information, no piggyback. Perfect. But sometimes you get this whole halo of piggyback information. And one hypothesis that we put forward, we think might be worth actually investigating, is that evolution of capable sensors are far more capable than it looks they would be needed for the concrete survival of the concrete type of agent, emerge through this phenomenon. And thus you have sensors that are much more powerful, much more general than the sensors you would get if you had just a specialized sensor for that particular feature. In short, we think if information theory helps evolution to create niche independent or halfway niche independent sensors that can do many more niches than the original niche they evolved for. That is kind of the short version of the story.
Has this been written up yet?
Sorry?
Have you done a write-up of this yet?
There is a paper where we actually discuss this question. It's published in a relatively small venue, but the core idea is already there. So if you want to read it, it's actually Zander van Dijk and myself, and A-Live, I think 2012. I can forward the reference. And essentially the core idea is already there. And of course, that needs further explanation. I mean, the piggyback effect has reappeared in different guises. People have seen it, but I don't think that they have linked it to evolution the way I have suggested it here. But for example, Jim Crutchfield talks about this phenomenon as crypticity. I don't know why he calls it this way. I don't know what's his interpretation, but he calls it crypticity. Cosma Shalizi mentions it in his thesis, actually.
Crypticity?
Crypticity. That's, I think, Jim Crutchfield's term.
Like crypticness?
Yes. Yes.
I'm wondering if he has there's this idea of cryptic variation in evolution, where it's there's all this genetic, it's this genetic, it's connected maybe to pre-adaptation, but it's you've accumulated this reservoir of genetic diversity because the I don't know if it's the reach through of selection, or you're so much shielded, and then you've built up from this cryptic variation. There's this idea of evolutionary capacitance, where it's you can enter into a rapid evolution regime because you've built up this repertoire that's been so much shielded. I don't, so that's a term. Cryptic has come up in that context. It's an idea that's been obsessing me somewhat.
Yeah, is there anything written up on that? I would be interested in that.
I'll try to find it. So I encountered from, I think, Massimo Pagliucci, I think, but cryptic variation and evolutionary capacitance.
That sounds very much related, right? And it would be really great to see other people thinking about that, because I always feel it's very difficult to formulate a hard experiment, for example, or a hard prediction for biology, except that it's plausible and that we can simulate the advantages of that in very simple scenarios.
And so, like, abstractly, I'm wondering, like, is there like a connection of, like, we could say evolvability or learnability, slash controllability or evolvability. But in this case, like, maybe there's, so the specific modeling done within the context of evolutionary theory, then, what could be taken from then for learning systems. That'd be interesting.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think, I mean, people may call it transfer learning. I don't so much like it, because it's not really that the transfer is really learned. It's implicit. It emerges. It's a potentiality. So when you say evolutionary capacity, that's more like what I had in mind. It's something that's just there, in the same way that I think we talked about, that the crystal has a capacity of forming in a space where structure there's constrained volume, that has capacity to form it. It doesn't mean that it's there in a hard sense, right? It's potential to go there. And I really like the link to open-ended evolution, because yes, I do think that this is how you get overpowered sensors. Our sensors, I mean, I keep saying that, and the people who know me will probably already have heard it X times from me, but sensors in nature and biology, not always, but in surprisingly many cases, have evolved to be totally overpowered. You think, why would humans need to have receptors that can pick up individual photons? I mean, in earlier experiments, people thought that they could detect clusters of 10 to 20 photons. It turns out that they probably can go down to individual photons. Individual photons can be detected. There are toads for which this has been proven many years ago, many decades ago already. They can pick up individual photons. You would wonder why. Why would you operate at the limit of the physically possible? The auditory sense, similar. There are the pickup of physical signals is often really at the limit of what's possible. And there's no good reason to just talk about selection, because then you say, oh yeah, selection selects out, and you don't have to be the best if you are just a toad or just a human that doesn't even, hunt in the night. We don't even hunt in the night. We are not nocturnal animals. So it's another reason, and I do like the structural reason. It says, well, there may be no explicit reason for that, no evolutionary reason at least. It's a reason that emerges from the structure of how you extract information from space. Suddenly, you have this capacity, which is just there for you to explore and to exploit. It becomes part of your exploitation space without actually having been part of your environment. It's purely informational. So I really like that, because it explains very naturally, or it would, if it can be established, it would explain very naturally why we have such a variation of sensors, and why it's easy to acceptate sensors. You move from one niche to another, and it's possible to do that. And it's not transfer learning that has been imposed upon us. It's just emerging from the structure of how information is being picked up from the environment. It's implicit.
So based on empowerment, you'd be looking for this kind of handshake between conditioning on your actuators. How much information can you now predict at your sensors? But the handshake is now asymmetric. We're just observing that, like, we have this exquisite sensitivity on the one hand, but on the sensing side, but on the actuating side, it's fairly it's still exquisite, but gross compared to what can be affected, given like what we can do with our actuators. Like we don't need the photon resolution or like that degree of discriminability as we get from sound necessarily for given what we can do. And so this trying to augment your data until eventually you can get this clean signal, you basically are trying to bring in this piggyback information so that you can make your way to a situation where you have enough of a signal that it can make that handshake in the right way. Something like this, like so enough of a signal where like the information coming in can get you the decision worthy, high confidence information. But because the data coming in is both, it's noisy and of uncertain provenance or uncertain origins. It's like, it's not curated for the sake of, even though we try to do this with our behavior to try to get the best information we can. So we want to take in even more of it so we can get this contextualizing piggyback information that we're using to create the higher fidelity signal. Something like this, is that the?
Yes, it's actually quite close. Yes, it's very close to it. It's a different way of saying it, but I like it because it sheds another light on the matter. Actuators, in the sense, are not symmetric in the sense that you can choose your actions, but as information comes to the sensors, you have to have an environment that, or you need to actually adapt to the environment. So the sensors have a lot of selection pressure to look at a certain form and pick up information in a certain form. And this creates a lot of piggyback effects, usually, not always, but usually. While the actuators can be, they're basically pure, right? Actions are pure in the sense that you can actually get rid of all the fluff if you need to. Just get rid of anything that's actions are pure relevance. Well, usually, unless there's a politician talking, but yeah, that's that's just something else, right? Actions are pure relevance, or much purer relevance than sensing, and that's why
These probability distributions of everything for the action, there's this one trajectory that's taken. Like once it's over, something's overly enacted, or
it's more than that. It's essentially when you observe our environment, we pay much more attention to other agents. And the reason is that what they do has meaning, far more meaning, is pre-filtered in terms of meaning. So, for example, you can imagine that, I don't know,
I see.
You observe, for example, what others are doing to understand where is the food court, where is the bathroom, where is the exit. You observe others, right? This is much more informative than just looking around. And this is actually quite common. I mean, we use other agents to get help about our environment. So animals, ground animals, listen to birds or observe birds. If they behave in a weird way, they know there's danger lurking, and they act accordingly. So in other words, other organisms, other agents are far more informative about the environment than the environment itself. The environment is, just there and the way it is, but there's the pre-processed information of other organisms.
Last week you were mentioning like a silent forest is an uncanny thing.
Yes.
It's like the birds aren't singing, something's wrong. And so basically the birds are filtering through, handling that they're taking in with all this piggyback information and extracting, basically they're curating your data for you, and they're giving you these estimates of like, is there something salient happening that you should be paying attention to? Probably it's something unknown. And in a world where things are trying to eat each other, that could be threatening. And so you now have a sense.
Exactly. So so that everybody is, this happened to a friend of mine in a particular country, and basically he saw everybody going down on their face. He understood, oh, okay, I think I should do that too, right? and that was basically a shootout that he witnessed. And basically that is kind of one example for that. He didn't realize himself, he didn't have the information for that, but the other people had it and interpreted it. And so actions are very valuable, are concentrated information. While sensoric input is not, it has to be extracted, therefore it's highly structured, and it has this effect of this piggybacking, which seems to be, looks like it's just fluff, it's just unnecessary, but then it turns out it's not. And that is a surprising part of it, that actually this piggyback can be useful for other things. We, at this stage, don't know the link between how does environment need to look like and how does a piggyback give you acceptation opportunities to other states in the environment. This is not understood. We would really like to know and have a good idea of how to look at this to model, to understand better how evolution, for example, works. So definitely I would be interested in this evolutionary capacity question. Definitely it's relevant for open-ended evolution. And I do think that the question of what piggyback, how its structure is linked to the structure of the environment and your own constraints. Because, for example, if you look at the housefly essentially processes its visual information almost directly into movement. So you basically can use the optical flow. The fly can use the optical flow to predict how am I moving, how I'm supposed to move, and almost directly process it. So essentially, we could say there's practically no piggyback there. Everything is just pure information.
To like making like the eye like a somewhat more capable deep net on its own, and then like feeding that into like the mushroom bodies and then like action modes. So it's like maybe you know, or just like fewer transitions, like
And
more
less
direct,
fluff.
yeah, just a direct like perception action mapping more.
Yes, you turn, you know, your leaf field, your vector field of your optical flow directly into movement information that can be directly processed into action. That is would be an example for no piggyback.
Could I think?
Yeah,
I think of piggyback information almost like parity bits, like in terms of like error correction.
I don't think it's error correction. That's something different. Because error correction is quite ungracious. It's actually the opposite. It's almost if you like, I don't know, I'm just talking through my head here, but I don't think it's error correction. It's actually the opposite. It turns input far more gracious to deviations. If things change, you have a far bigger leeway doing other things and changing things and changing the environment. So I think it's probably the opposite. Parity bits are actually quite, it's the opposite. They would
like parity bits, it's like you're like constraining, trying to get this like precise and really exact disambiguation. But here you're actually trying to manage your uncertainty in a way.
Yes, distribute your risk essentially. You will say, I don't trust one source. I have all these sources and they tell me different things. And because they tell me a lot of different things, they may tell me about things that I actually had no interest in the first place. But then it turns out that actually they are relevant if I change niche. Or if I increase my niche. So you decide I'm assimilating a niche. I have a niche which, okay, I want to add this niche. And then you add the niche and become more and more capable. And maybe that's one driver for high intelligence. We know that high intelligence is not an exclusive domain of mammals or even vertebrates, right? If you think of birds and mammals, you find it in octopuses. Octopuses are super intelligent animals, and they live in a completely different branch of our evolutionary tree. How did they get there? And maybe there was some kind of piggyback style drive that just created a runaway process where the process only stops once you reach a trade-off limits of energy, speed, energy consumption, speed, added value, etc. So if that you don't hit that thing, it can go all the way. I mean, look at humans. Humans now starting to hit that because of climate limitations and energy limitations, population limitations. But essentially, before that happened, it was a runaway process until they hit the limit of agricultural production. Then industrial revolution, again, runaway process. And I do think we might be able to understand us parts of this phenomenon, certainly not everything, but certain aspects of this phenomenon by a piggyback effect. You do something and you have all these extra degrees of freedom that suddenly pop up, which you didn't ask for. They're just there. They just appear. And of course, now they are available for further exploitation.
The connection to intelligence and humanness. So we were talking about personality earlier, and of the big five, it's interesting that openness has the strongest correlations with intelligence. You can divide openness usually into openness to experience and openness intellect, which tends to have more correlation, but you see correlations for both. And I'm also thinking, I guess, somewhat in terms of like, this might be an analogy too far, but like more exploratory cognitive modes and ideas of humans as being like especially neotenic apes, like especially juvenile and exploratory. I'm wondering if like that's actually in some ways like trying to like amass this piggyback information for these like complex niches that we're constructing, like that we actually, yeah.
I wouldn't, if the piggyback hypothesis is correct, and only if, right? Because this is a hypothesis at this stage, then you would not actually actively seek it. It would emerge from the necessity to fit an environment. So from an evolutionary point of view, you are actually indifferent or probably even a little bit predisposed to not have piggyback. Piggyback is wasteful in the first stage. You don't want to piggyback, right? If I can get the pure information straight out of the box, comes a preprocessed, plug in, works. That's what you want as an evolutionary system. If you have a perfect evolutionary system, in my opinion, the housefly, I once wrote an what you call popular science piece on the housefly and its intelligence. And one of the things I made, points I made, I don't remember the precise text, but one of the points I've made is said, this is almost a perfect being. It's a perfect being in the sense, we don't like it, right? Because it sits on everything that's kind of whatever, on trash and on your food, and it doesn't make a difference. But in terms of its adaptation, it's perfect. But it doesn't need piggyback. It just gets information it needs for movement, gets information it needs for whatever it needs to do, and that's it. Nothing superfluous. Perfect adaptation.
So would this be part of like ways in which like someone facing challenge or an especially challenging environment or a crisis, like growth could come after that? Could some of that be mediated by like that situation you're in would build up this piggyback information, this like diversity, this repertoire, which then is promoting a later, I guess, post-traumatic growth or for the system from challenge.
This is, sorry, I interrupted you.
I interrupted you first.
This is the traditional pathway to talk about exploration or emergence of open-endedness. If I talk about piggyback, I take the opposite stance. Actually, I don't care about exploration. I don't care at all about it. Right? All I care about is get me my relevant information. I want this piece of information. That's what I want. The problem is I can't get it, and to get it, I need to pass through this dirty layer of reality. that's imperfect, that I can't extract the information well, and it really sits uneasily. And I have to, if I'm competing, I want to get this information, and I have some advantage of getting a better amount of information. Of course, we know there's selectiveness, there's a competitiveness in the environment. So I want to be a bit better getting this one bit of information, whatever it is, and get a little bit better and a little bit better. And to get a little bit better, I need to get all this extra cloud, all this extra halo of information, which I never asked for. I don't want this. Why do you give it to me? Right? You go to this place and they give you all these vouchers for this and this. I don't want this. Just tell me what I want to know. But you can't. You have to go through this cloud of extra information, and now it's there. And you need to process it to be that good. And suddenly your evolutionary process gets this additional options. Think of it empowerment on the evolutionary scale. Gets this extra options of you actually moving deeper, so assimilating this extra abilities for other goals that you assimilate to your life, and then you evolve and become more and more complex. Or alternatively, just you can move into a different niche, that your niche changes, or you can split off into a different niche. This option is suddenly there, which wouldn't have been there if you had just adapted to your one fixed niche, which some organisms do. Perfect parasites do that. The certain symbionts do that. They fit exactly this niche.
Well, you're saying that I'm introducing a kind of teleology prematurely, and that rather I'm introducing the wrong kind of teleology prematurely. So in theory, you could engage in something like a kind of play behavior to try to like optimize it. But the idea is this is just going to happen as a virtue of the way you're situated in the context of trying to seek out the information you need to achieve goals. Like this isn't like something that's necessarily you're like, this is not optional given your embedding. It's just gonna have like, yes. This isn't necessarily.
Exactly, it's not optional. It's not optional. It's not something you do. Yeah, we could do it. It is forced upon you if you want to be good at getting the relevant information. And suddenly the thing you're forced to do, and that look like a complete, obsolete processing of information, it becomes the key for complexity acquisition or for moving to sideways into other niches. And so I think that's why I find this idea so intriguing, because you essentially not anymore having this. One thing that I always have a problem with are models that try to fit into things that we know. We know this is happening. We know this is doing that. And so we squeeze a model, make it open-ended evolution. How do we get open-ended evolution? Here, the position we're trying to take is, no, we don't ask for open-ended evolution. We don't even care about that. We rather say, oh, there's this weird phenomenon. And what does this phenomenon do? Is it actually existent? And suddenly it makes sense. Suddenly things start fitting together without actually having to make them fit together. In other words, something that I always like to say, when a theory knows more than whoever set it up, that's good theory, right? When the theory tells you things you haven't expected or didn't ask for, right? So I'm telling you this. I didn't ask for it.
Two things that are coming to mind are like, or three things. So one, it's like, certain, like, how do we get past certain like cart horse / chicken egg problems? Like, how do we begin? And so this is an account which is part of like, instead of begging questions and assuming the thing that we're just let there be open-ended learning, how did we get to that regime to begin with? And so this is basically giving us accounts where we're actually getting the major transitions in generalized evolution. And so also like, another analogy that's coming to mind is kind of like empowerment itself. Like it works, it might work better with like a complex world model, but you don't need one to do it. And the other question is, well, how did you get the world model to begin with? You needed something upstream of that worked even without a world model. Or then the other kind of like you're talking, so then also like this, it just gives it to you for free. Like earlier you were mentioning like, you had this breakdown of like modes of other empowerment or modes of like empowerment in a multi-agent context, where the same setup gets you in one place, forms of cooperativity, but you parameterize it slightly differently, forms of antagonism and different, but like it gave it to you. And you didn't have to put it in there to begin with, and then
Exactly. I do think that models that do this are telling you something, right? It doesn't mean that they're perfect models or they would describe everything, but models that tell you something you didn't ask for it, that push a statement to you, say, what is this doing? What does it mean? What does it tell me? If a model does that to me, and I suddenly can make sense out of it, that is a good model, because it it's like nature talks to us in the way. And it seems like information theory has lots of these, lots of models lots of phenomena that you didn't ask for, and they just force themselves upon you, say, okay, you didn't ask for me, but here I am. And I think by learning how to understand how information theory talks to us in a way, if I may say so, it's a poetic language, but really it means understanding the interpretation of what happens. We can actually start looking at things from a different perspective, instead of trying to just build a model that just describes what we see anyway. So rather saying, okay, what is the consequence of that? As you said, and then I didn't even think about that. Evolutionary capacity, open-ended evolution. It's not something I thought about. But that term suddenly tells you, okay, you have now these pathways of evolution which were not open before. And they just emerge by the fact that I am becoming more competitive at reading this piece of information from my relevance variable. And in my opinion, that is one way why information theory seems to really, and it's universal in the sense that you don't need a lot of sophistication to get the effect. You don't need to assume that there's a highly developed brain or something. You just need to be better at Kelly gambling. You just need to be better at gambling about the future of your organism than another organism. If you have this competition, you get this effect already. And now anything that accumulates ways of extracting this extra information suddenly creates this piggyback effect. You don't need many assumptions to get this runaway effect. I think I mentioned that last time, but I think it's apt to mention it again, that I heard about a recent paper where they claim that there might be a gene that distinguishes humans and Neanderthals, and that gene might have created additional growth of neurons and the neocortex. Now, under a piggyback perspective, suddenly things start making sense, right? So assuming it would be a valid hypothesis, having a mutation that creates more cells that can process this extra information, wherever it comes from, whatever it is, whatever nature it is, suddenly you get all these places where you can organize your information in a better way. It's a bit like having space to unpack your trunk. You need to pack your trunk. You can't pack your trunk, so you need more space to organize it better. But then you organize it better, and suddenly there's an organization principle that gives you additional possibilities which were not there before.
You start putting more things in it.
Putting more things in it and organizing in a better way, finding things more easily, or in the brain, clearly just finding connections between concepts that have been totally irrelevantly connected before. Who knows? Yeah. So, and the point is, I don't make any assumptions about the architecture here, right? It's a purely information theoretic statement. I don't say it's a network, it's a feed-forward network, it's a recurrent network. I don't make any statements like that. It may be any of them, but the point is, it's a purely informational statement, which means, yeah.
Well, with connection to like expansion of the brain, like I was wondering, like I mentioned Randy Buckner's hypothesis that basically this provided subnetworks that just because as the overall network expanded, would tend to become more shielded from the immediate like engagement with the sensorium. And so potentially would allow for basically different types of like overall system estimation and counterfactual abilities, because you have inner attracting states that kind of float free. And so if you're generating this diverse repertoire of piggyback information, I don't quite have this fully worked out, but I'm seeing how like you now have a mind, this mind is wider than the sky, is like that poem says, like you now have like a trunk capable, you have both more things to put in the trunk, and this is putting pressure on expanding the trunk.
Yes. Yes, it's a very good point. Could you forward me the paper, please? The link. That's very kind. I think that's exactly how it's mutual, right?
He doesn't frame it information theoretically, but that's the connection.
It doesn't matter. I mean, there's no the information theoretic perspective makes it clear that this is a fundamental phenomenon, but seeing how that would be implemented is another very nice way of seeing it. How do you get it? I give you extra memory, just use it, right? And there's a pressure, you use it, and suddenly you become better easily, cheaply. So yeah, I do think that this is actually a nice way of seeing where maybe higher level structures come from, without actually forcing them onto the organism, without postulating, oh, it has to evolve becoming more complex. No, it doesn't have to evolve and become more complex. This is just a fact that it can extract this one bit, or that it needs to distinguish better, which is just a normal, totally traditional evolutionary competition. And now you have this piggyback information, you have more cells by which you can process it, suddenly you become better at that. Suddenly you have all these extra cells that do stuff, and can you do something else with that? And your pathway is open.
But you might not have like an adequate causal story unless you have this initial pre-adaptation account. Like it's kind of reminded me of like and people attempt to do like the origins of language evolution. It's like, well, what good is a bunch of speakers without people who could comprehend? And so then that's part of, I think, why Chomsky's saying, well, he tried to get like language was originally for thought. So it's like, what good is half a wing? What good is a speaker without a listener? That is like, no, that was our thinking. And so like you're already the whole way through. And then he was looking for, some sort of macro mutations and some minimal grammar. But the idea though being like, how do you get these things, overcoming these chicken egg problems? Like how do you get adaptations going when the selective pressures would not have been there to begin with to get them off the ground, or even like some like paradoxes of just like even like talking about like self-replication. Like how do you get a self-replicator? Like how do you get something which, if the self itself is dependent on this replicative ability, how does that get off the ground? You need to have some causal account that precedes this new regime and enables it. And so piggyback information would provide basically a means of understanding some forms of pre-adaptation that potentially could involve that singularity in the past where we became imaginative and symbolic. Maybe some of this is explained by differences in the way we we're doing this kind of this peculiar kind of data augmentation and boosting of signals that we're forced to do.
I mean, language is a very difficult concept, and until recently, I deliberately stayed away from it. Not because it's not interesting, but because I had absolutely no idea how to get there. I start to have a feeling for how one could get there. I mean, there are much smarter people in the field, people who know much more than I do. So I like to take the naive perspective on things like that. I say, I don't believe, personally, I don't believe in a preordained grammar. I don't buy that. I think it's the opposite. I give you again my example with the box of oranges, right? So just to give you this example, I say, if I give you a box and it's empty, does it have a grammar or a structure? And think of it as now basically orange. Each orange roughly same size, and an orange is like a concept with a space around it. And now you throw the one orange in the box, and it rolls around. It can be anywhere in the box. Put a second orange, and it can roll around, and they have some constraints, but very minimal. And you put more and more oranges in the box. At some point, the oranges cannot move around freely anymore, and they're constrained into this hexagonal grid, which is the densest packing of oranges of roughly the same size. Now, this hexagonal grid was not in the box before, and it was not in the oranges. It emerges as the pressure of compressing all these oranges, that each of them takes some space and have to organize in this way. And suddenly the grammar, or the crystal structure in this case, has been born. So my very naive, and a really naive view of how grammar emerges is simply, you have this type of constraint of objects and concepts, and you want to put more and more in your communication. At some point, you have to organize it. And the organization imposes itself. And that's why languages are so different, because there's no, unless they have a common origin, there's no reason for them to be of the same kind. Maybe there's a limited number of grammars you can have. We don't know. But they're not, they're probably not, they're not arbitrary, certainly not. But I don't think they are a priori either. I think they are just a natural consequence of concentrating information. So if you want to study grammars, I would say we have to understand how to write the emergence of language as some kind of information constraint problem. And I mean, some people have tried that. For example, Ricard Soleil, E. Concho, and a couple of others have tried to do things like that, right? And I mean, there's a long way to go. Maybe there's some progress. I'm not an expert in the field, but I do think that it would be much more natural to assume, okay, language is simply, I want to talk to you. I have a limited channel. I have all these ideas. I can see all this room with all the things, but still, grammar is essential. If you look at Archimedes we talked about Archimedes earlier, trying to talk to his fellow scientists. And sorry?
He needed to build up a packaging scheme. So like the folio method. And then he's like in Archimedes Codex, this book you recommend, he's building up a new way of packaging thinking that can be shared with others.
Well, I mean, I don't think the Codex is his invention, but the way he writes math is a way of communicating. So actually the book on Archimedes Codex discusses how does Archimedes talk about geometrical arguments. There's a certain way they unpack it. Of course, today we have much better ways of doing that. We learn to do that, and we get better at doing that. That's why people invent things like category theory, for example, to try to talk about math in a more universal, more compact, more generalizable way. All of this is compression, trying to compress the information, making the information more accessible, easier to manage, easier to modify. And this is what we want. It's not that, anyway, I mean, I don't want to argue with the people who believe grammar is a priori, but I personally don't buy it. I think grammar is emerging, and it emerges from the need to have efficient access to concepts, efficient communication of concepts, making it reliable, stable, and make it easy to learn too. It has to be easy, relatively easy, because otherwise it gets difficult. If you read machine code or you read badly written computer code, you see that if there's no structure to code, it still works. But you don't understand what it's doing. Write it in a structured way, suddenly I understand what it's doing. Same operation. But the code, one code is readable, the other one is not. Readable means, yes?
So later, I'm going to want to drag you back into personalities. And I wonder to what degree you can even think of like personalities as a kind of packaging of the agent for the sake of legibility, both to others and oneself across time. A kind of like to what extent, like this account of grammar, like like there's modes that you need to structure this. Anyways,
The question is, do you want that, right? So what would be the process that profits from this? The agent, probably not. At least mostly of the time not. So who profits from that? Perhaps evolution, perhaps social structures. In fact, social structures seem to want that, right? So if you look at totalitarian systems, they like the new human. They talk about the new man or whatever it is, right?
new
And
Soviet man,
sorry,
the new Soviet man.
exactly. That's one example.
We'll create a different shape.
Different totalitarian systems have different views of what it is, but it's a well-defined, clear interface. Yeah. So yes, maybe for that you want this type of character, but personalities don't care about that, right? The real personalities that emerge in evolution don't seem to care about what totalitarian systems want. It's an actually interesting evolutionary experiment to see whether, say, countries like a certain country in East Asia, very totalitarian country in East Asia, if they go on for another several generations, if they will have evolved to a type of personality type that actually converges with the ideals of their totalitarian expectation. Maybe that is actually a very interesting evolutionary experiment, and not exactly ethical, but it is something that, say, if it goes on for another 4 or 5 generations, I do think we will see differences. These people will be having properties of essentially the imposed upon totalitarian perspective. So this is an interesting prediction that we might actually see some structure, that we might see emergence of specific personality traits. It looks like we are
Getting bombed. So
we are at the point where we are being told that enough is enough.
not in my opinion. So maybe next time you can guide me through the ways that empowerment shows up in the shaping of personality in different ways.
Absolutely. I will be delighted to, and it was a very good conversation. It's getting late here, but still the concentration is still okay. So obviously it was, your questions are very good. And we went into a direction which I didn't expect, but that's good.
I mean, I'm glad we did. It's relevant for a lot of things I'm thinking about right now. But I'm looking forward to next time.
Thank you very much, Adam.
Thank you, Daniel.